Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where I talk with the world's leading thinkers, planners, and doers who are helping to build great companies in their own way. We learn how the work they're doing is creating an impact and get to know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick. This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. Also, you can check out our books, Made to Thrive, outlining how to be a great CEO, as well as Onboarded, which is about making your new hires more effective faster. Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast summer series, the series that quite clearly operates through the summer here in the Southern Hemisphere, where we are. Welcome, Richard and Andreas, to this conversation. Fall in love with your business again. It feels a bit timely, between Christmas and New Year. What am I doing? I'm looking at the beach. I'm doing all the stuff that we do, all for half of Australia, skiing in Japan. Let's kick it off with our word or phrase of the day. Andreas, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, thank you, Brad. My word is reflection. And that's because over the last couple of weeks, I've been reflecting on, the year has been, the relationships with family, with friends, with our clients. So I find myself in this reflecting moment. That's my word.
Rich.
Well, it's post-Christmas. I'm thinking returns. I'm thinking about all the things I have to get back to the stores now because they weren't quite right. So either as received or given. But it's a silly thing, but it's that time of the year where I've got to do some.
Mine is trapped, just because that's the kind of person I am. It's a time when you think, am I trapped in my business? It's a time when you think, is this the freedom that I want all the time? And that may be a bit contextual, but it's just the word that came to mind. So we've got reflective, returns, and trapped. Why do I keep doing this to myself every week, trying to stitch these bloody things together? I don't know why. But it's somewhat connected, right? Because at this time of year, we're talking about, do I actually love my business? Once upon a time, I used to love it. I used to love the excitement, the energy. And as I reflect, am I trapped? That's all I got. So let's jump in.
Yeah.
That's good enough, mate. So sometimes we meet owners who've fallen out of love with their business, right? I think that we kind of, We've drifted into this idea, or we've picked up and noticed it. Like, do you really love your business? Did you used to love it? Do you think you could love it again? And it's been a really powerful thermometer on how people are relating or have a relationship with their business. People turn up on Mondays and they that first day of the week, they don't want to go in. The spark that they had is gone. But it takes years for this to happen. And then it's often sometimes been the realization when we've asked the question, they've gone, no, I don't. I think in the book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better, we talk about drift, and that teams drift towards toxicity, customers drift toward mediocrity, customers drift towards indifference, customers drift towards mediocrity, and offerings drift toward mediocrity. I'll get it right one day. And financials drift towards unprofitability. So this drift occurs when we stop working on the business, and when we're focused on bigger, it accentuates. When an owner is chasing this bigger instead of better, and they're enamored with growth for growth's sake, this drift speeds up. Instead of compounding what works into a better business by building better teams and better customers and better offerings and better financials, when you're focused on bigger predominantly, putting another zero on things, you're supercharging the drift that wears you down. And then the frustration sets in, things that used to work don't work. And it feels like a machine that you're trapped inside of. I've been there. I know other people that I've worked with and been friends with have been there. And you can only take so many body blows from so many directions, and then the business and your life becomes somewhat joyless. And often people think about selling the business might be the only escape. And we just see it way too often. Owners who fall out of love with the business that they deeply cared about And it's something that I know the two of you can relate to. Rich, any reflections on the intro?
Yeah, I think, it's one of the saddest things I hear. One of the very first things I often do when I meet somebody is, tell me about your business. And I love it when people start telling me about, great customers and great market and the product's growing and we're thriving and then I get the other version, which is, I'm frustrated, I'm sad, I'm tired, I'm feeling guilty. And when I hear that, it goes back to this idea that the very promise of the company is not being delivered upon. And it just makes me sad. And I just want to sort of reach in and say, how do I help? Regardless of how that might look, but just how do I help? Nobody wants to be sad running a business.
Yes, indeed. Andreas, initial reflections.
Yes, I hear this a lot when, as you said, Richard, the tone is just different. The sadness in their eyes, and clearly they just want an out. Whether it's selling or can I bring someone to run the whole thing and I need to get out just because I cannot take it anymore. Although they still love that, or they have that initial will for love, but it's not there anymore. It's like that lack of sparkle, as you said, Brad. And it's tough and it hits me hard because I've seen that with clients, I've seen that with friends, I've seen that very close to my heart, even with my parents as well. So um, it's a tough moment for a lot of owners when they go through that falling out of love.
Drift's right. It's not that on Tuesday I loved it and on Wednesday I fell out of love. It happens over years. And I've seen people start secondary businesses or satellite businesses or side hustles, whatever you want to call it, basically putting their efforts into ways that are, let's just say, unprofitable hobbies that they call businesses because they get bored and they don't love it and they've kind of lost a sense of purpose. So how do you think that we get here? How do you think that owners end up in this situation? And what do you think of the early signs? Rich?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to that idea that, you hear it when they say, I feel guilty or exhausted. But I think, when you probe a little bit deeper, it's often there was a lot of signs. And a lot of it comes back to the fact that they didn't take the time to adapt or reinvent as things started to grow. Now, whether it's adding more competent folks to the team, whether it's, questioning their strategy a little bit more or thinking about accountability or execution, they get so caught up in the doing and in almost like the treadmill effect of like they're just putting in the miles, so to speak. And they lose sight of the fact of why they started this business. And I think that's one of the ones I often use as a question, when I meet people for the first time or exploring a need for a coach. I sort of go back to that, why did you start this business? Like what, I'm trying to reconnect them back to that a moment when they had this brilliant idea or they were courageous enough to do something that nobody else was willing to do or put in the effort to do. And you see the spark again. And because I just want them to feel that again for a moment so that I can hopefully get them then to start answering some other questions. But I think it's missing the signals along the way.
And that's the part of the catalyst for the book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better. It's that you started the business for freedom and now it feels like a trap. Andreas, any thoughts?
Yes. So just following what you were saying, Richard, when we meet with people and we ask these questions, also another question is, what is the impact that you want the business to have in your life? Because, and these are sort of early signs when they think, what do you mean? No, I just need to build this. And because society says that it has to be bigger, that's what I learned, I'll take it to a point and eventually I'll go back to my life. But if they don't start linking their business with their personal life and what they want from their business, eventually, as you mentioned, Brad, that invisible perhaps drift, eventually it eventuates and it almost sounds like an overnight result, when it actually was that subtle move or drift towards that point.
It makes me think about a business owner I spoke to, I think it was last week or the week before, a trades business and maybe 20 million, somewhere around there. And he was telling me how he continually oscillates over months between selling the business and keeping the business. And something happens and he's like, oh, stuff it, I want to sell it. I've had enough. And then something else happens and then he's like, oh no, we got to keep it. And it's this horrible oscillation where you don't really feel the joy, the love, you don't really feel the permanency, and you're not solving the underlying issues, and it wears you out. And it's really born of this impulsive risk takers, the signature trait of entrepreneurs, which is impatient and undisciplined actions. So what actually happens when owners fall out of love with their business? I think it'd be good to consider this through the first book that I wrote, the book Made to Thrive, which is about the 5 roles of a CEO. In talking about the 5 roles of a CEO, we also must consider the 5 results that great CEOs produce. So the 5 roles of a CEO came about because if we only focus on profit and we're setting fire to the balance sheet, we're not actually a great CEO. Or if our attrition is through the roof for employees, we're not really a great CEO. So we think about the results that great CEOs produce from that book. Number 1 out of 5 is a higher percentage of top performers. So if the owner has fallen out of love with the business, they're not going to be passionately attracting A players to a soulful team with a clear vision. So it's somewhat, to be a great CEO, to create the kind of business that you want, you're not necessarily going to have a higher percentage of top performers. Second is higher retention. If you're disengaged as the leader, or you're just going through the motions, people know that. And it's a great opportunity for the best people to leave, because if you don't really care, why should I care? Third is higher productivity. If you don't want to go to work on Monday morning, there's a good chance that the people that follow you will feel the same way. So they're not going to be as productive as they could be. People respect what you inspect. Fourth, consistent growth. So if you don't deeply care about the business and are committed to it, and you're working to fight drift, to work on the business, you're not going to achieve that strong strategy and execution that relates to that consistent growth. And then finally, consistent results. If strategy, execution, and succession planning weaken, the results become inconsistent. So whilst we're looking for better teams, better customers, better offerings, and better financials, when the owner falls out of love with the business, the roles that they should be performing to create great results aren't happening, and then the results suffer. So Andreas and Richard, thinking and drawing upon that perhaps, when have you seen owners fall out of love with their business?
Well, one of the consulting firms that I'm working with, maybe a year ago, we had a conversation with the owner. He started with, "Oh, what if I open, let's say, a different business?" So my question was, "Okay, why? What's the reason? What would happen if you did with your role as the owner of this one, of the consulting firm?" And he said, yeah, well, maybe someone can actually run it for me, and then I can do something that perhaps is a bit more joyful." And that is the word that he used. And one of the things that he used to do, well, he keeps doing that now, it's fortnightly video to all of his team members. And in that video, he would talk about reinforce core values, core purpose, and his vision. And he realized that the tone, the energy of the videos started to go down. And every time that he would talk about these ideas, satellite ideas, let's call it like that, he will sparkle again. His eyes will shine again. So we understood the impact that will have in the main business. And that's the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, where he regained that part of love, or original love. And probably going back to what you said, Richard, it's reinforcing those fundamentals that are deeply connected to why they wanted to do that in the first place and what's really going on in their personal lives. And he was going through some tough things in the personal life that he couldn't actually understand or couldn't link those things with the company. And that's exactly what we did. We linked the impact that he truly wanted to create in the community. He had a passion for that with the results of the company. And he understood that if he were to generate the results, going back to the roles that of the CEO, he would be able to help the community in different ways.
Mm.
So that was the big realization perhaps that he had. And what I've seen, it's a great example that I share with a lot of companies.
Yeah, I think if I could pick up on that, I'll try and connect those two thoughts, the framework of Made to Thrive with your story there, Andres. I think one of the challenge though is that, you know, we can help people think about the roles that a CEO should be playing. But sometimes what I also notice is they confuse the metric and the actions required. And let me give you a subtle example of that. So we want high retention because we see that as a outcome, shall we say, of a good business. But what I try to also understand is that true overall, or is that in a specific area? And so one of the things I've seen in a business I've been working with, they're a manufacturing lighting installation business. And they're, you know, great business, really interesting business, got a really interesting niche. But the challenge that was happening, I think, is that sometimes we don't see the signals and we confuse the metrics. And so what had happened was a lot of attrition was happening at lower and lower levels, but the management team wasn't picking up on that because the leader wasn't asking as many questions. And it was just a subtle tweak. And I sort of said, well, why did they leave? And don't take the example of, oh, it's for better pay or like, and then if that doesn't resonate, were they right to leave?
Yeah.
And when you ask that question a little bit, it just gets deeper into, and you start to examine what are those, as you said, Brad, what are those subtle things that you may be doing as an owner that are starting to send a message that you're falling out of love with the business. And I think, you know, it's this honest reflection on some of these things and digging a little bit deeper. You get to what is the real issue? You know, why is it that joy is not there? And I think it's sort of using some of these frameworks sometimes I find it's really interesting to sort of just dig a little bit deeper into the what was actually happening, what's really going on.
A few weeks ago, I met with a husband and wife business owners, and they were working really, really hard. They were working 7 days a week. They were worn out. They were explaining to me what they're doing at 6 o'clock on a Sunday night or whatever it is. I was saying to them, well, I think you need to effectively do some quarterly planning. You need to go off site and you need to plan. And they were just like, I don't think you understand. We're working in the business so much. And I said, so what's the escape? What's the ripcord that you can pull? How do you get out of this horrible situation? I mean, they had employees. It was a business of about, let's say, 5 million. But they just couldn't, they just were just totally trapped in that environment. And it leads to them falling out of love. They feel this way. They think there's no path forward. What did we do is probably what you're thinking. We just started off by simply saying, what's causing this? How do we make that not a problem in 1 year? And what do we need to do in 90 days? That was the first annual priority and the first quarterly priority. What's the next biggest thing? And then what do we need to do in 90 days? So just by identifying, working through it, I could literally see their face drop between the beginning, in a good way, and the end of the meeting. Just their shoulders, they felt like they had some kind of way to get out of that. I think it makes me think about another business as well, where they had taken years to recover from an industry downturn. It was really tough for them. And then just as they started to see the light at the end of the tunnel, they realized that light was in fact a train called COVID that was coming at them. And then they just needed to survive. So then they had the second kind of hit, as many people did, right? And I think it's not unreasonable to say there is a mental health hang up from COVID that we still need to work through, but we still need to have an ambition and we still need to build enduring great business. So anyway, that business, they're now they've recovered from that, continued to work to build a better business, and they're moving again. What goes wrong when you fall out of love? And are there any examples of how owners fall back in love with their business? Richard?
Yeah, I think there's many ways you could sort of take that question, but to me, it's about stop thinking through everything has to be solved as you as the owner. And I think you need to enlist help. What I'm talking about here is like, when you start thinking about the plan for the coming year or the plan for the next couple of years, if all of that effort is you and there's no participation by the team, whether it's the leadership team or just the small team you have in that, and they're not helping build that plan, there's so much more angst and responsibility you're loading onto yourself. And I think, one of the things I see so often is when we open up and we do a workshop and we have a few more people in the business talking about the business and it's structured as an agenda, what we start to surface is all those little elephants that were, they were just minor signals of drift.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, there are things that, and when you ask the question, what's that elephant in the business, a product, a service line, a person, a function that we don't talk about and we should do something about, there's this sort of everybody looks around and says, are we free to talk? And then I say, yeah, this is healthy. And we may not solve all of them, but let's talk about them. And sure enough, that's so freeing. And then the answer is, so what do we do in the next 90 days to address that? What could we do? Just one thing. And it's that realization by the owner that, yes, you are the custodian of the business and you are the owner of the business, but that does not mean that you're fully responsible for every single thing. And sometimes inviting in a few trusted A players with their best interests of the company at mind and at heart, suddenly you get these wonderful little breakthroughs. And it's often, both you and Andreas have said, it's often just the one thing we could go do for the next 90 days that just flips the switch. And then the next 90 days we do it again. And it flips the switch again. And all of a sudden you just see, as you said, shoulders go sort of a little bit more up and there's a bit more posture and they're feeling a little bit more in because they're starting to see a way forward. But I think too often we get caught. I talked about treadmill. I think we get caught in this treadmill if we just keep doing and doing and doing and doing. We need to find time to reflect on things and sometimes ask for that external perspective, even if it's just from the team who's seeing it and is afraid to say something.
I mean, that's why the business is called Evolution Partners. That's why this podcast is called Evolution Partners, because there is no such thing as a once done and one, let's go off site for 2 days and everything will be sorted. It takes the consistent compounding, quarterly planning rhythm, annual planning rhythm, weekly meetings, a lot of these things coming together. It is the consistency that creates the results that you want. Andreas, what goes wrong when you fall out of love? And how do you fall? Any examples of how owners have fallen back in love with their business?
So back in November, I had a meeting with the owner of a business, very successful business, from all different aspects. You could see their financials, and it's fantastic. 25% net profit plus attrition. If it's not 1% or 2%, it's very, very close. Every different angle was like fantastic, but the owner said, I want out. This is just too hard. It's too much. And the thing that actually we did, and we've been working relentlessly on that, was tell me about the role that you have today. You could probably expect this person spend 20 minutes listing all of the things that she used to do. And then we shifted the conversation to what is the role that you would like to have? Being the owner, at least create that for yourself. And the role expectation was completely different. What actually followed from that was, all right, and now, as we discussed in the previous episode, how do we actually cascade down that delegation that we need to all of these things that you don't like doing? So you can focus on what only you can do and you're passionate about and you love doing, and it gives you energy. Because the worst thing that can happen is that when you feel that trap and the things that you don't like doing, that drains your energy. So that was one of the things. It took some time, as you said, Brad, right? That's why it's an evolution. But that felt right for the person.
Yeah.
And that person said, all right, now it's one less thing that I'm doing because I successfully delegated that to someone else. And I'm focusing a bit more on what I love doing and what I love doing, what I love doing. Today, she has a 100% role that she loves doing. And the way that she talks about the business is completely different.
I can remember when I was constructing this book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better. And I think it's on page 3 or 4 or 5. In the first few pages, nonetheless, there is this 2x2 matrix, which is patience and discipline, where in the bottom left corner, we've got people who are impatient and undisciplined, as I mentioned earlier, the impulsive risk taker being the signature of the entrepreneur. And not many people are dumb enough to put a 2x2 matrix that early in a book, but it just felt like this is the thing. This is what I did, what I've seen so many people do, and it makes me reflect on a entrepreneur who I know quite well, who spent all their time chasing shiny new objects. I need to open a new office. I need to start doing something else. Every time they got bored, they would start something new and never really execute well. And then they'd move on to the next thing. And it's terribly expensive. And it all really got too much for them, to be fair. Over a few years, a few things happened as we built a strategy over time. The bad ideas, probably to your point, Richard, became elephants, and those elephants had to be resolved. So, for example, I was saying to them, all right, so when are we going to shut down that office? What is the cost of that office? How do we justify it? When do we get to break even? Where is the business case that means we should keep that open for another year or 2 or 3? And I think that the process of continually coming back and planning and strategic thinking and working through the elephants and the problems, it kind of worked in this case. And I have a direct quote from that same person. I would say it was a year ago where it really came to a crescendo. That person said, I've never made so much money in my life and I've never been happier. Not because of the money, but because they've fallen back in love with the business. So, you got to do the work, but you got to know what the work is that you're doing. You don't know what you don't know, but these impulses that are natural human nature can work against what you really want. So what do all of these stories have in common? The owners who fell back in love with their business, they've got a business that works for them, that gives them energy rather than drains their energy. It's the key question for a CEO, right? Or a leader is, what parts of the job that I do bring me energy and which parts drain my energy? Yeah, you might say the whole freaking thing drains my energy. Okay, well then there's maybe a bit more of a task to do there. But they've also built a proven business operating system that takes them from being an impulsive risk taker to being a strategic executor, where they understand the strategy, they understand their goals, they're working towards those things, and they're confidently disciplined in the path quarter after quarter after quarter, week after week after week. So for a business owner listening now, what should they do to act on this issue?
So the first thing, it could be start with a planning session. Get your leadership team together in an offsite session and start planning what would the business look like in a year time and what would be the top 3, perhaps top 5 maximum key priorities. So then we can break them down quarter by quarter, and then we can stick to those decisions and keep each other accountable on those decisions, because that is a good step towards that strategic executor.
I'll build on that a little bit. I think the same needs to be applied to your life a bit, because the business should be in service and in support of the life you want, not the other way around. So, obviously Better is Better talks about this extensively in one of the final chapters, but the simple version of it is, if you've got a goal for a year for your business, what's the goal for you personally on maybe 2 or 3 dimensions that are important to you? Quite frankly, how are you going to take steps towards that in conjunction with what the business needs over the next 90 days? Like, I know we keep coming back to this rhythm of meetings and priorities and metrics, but they set you free because they bring clarity. And once you get a little success in the first 90 days, you have a bit more confidence for the next 90 days. And I think you have to do both. And I think if you don't have that system today, that's something you've got to start exploring, because otherwise you're just on a treadmill and it's just, you're never, ever stepping off. And I think that's so important if you want to love your business.
think I've seen a lot of people sell their business and then regret it. And they're 40 years old. They're at the golf course hanging out with people who are 70 years old and they're going, is this my life? Am I going to spend the rest of my life doing this? And then they get bored and then they go and do something else. But I think it's a bit like a marriage, right? If you fall out of love with your partner in a marriage, what do? Do you get divorced or do you work on it? Well, I mean, my take would be, well, you work on it. Don't give up. There is something there that is worth working for. And it's the same with your business. There's something there that is worth working for. But I would say the first thing is just asking yourself the question, if I used to be in love with the business, am I still in love with the business? And what would be the one thing that would be different if I was more in love with the business? And that might be external, it might be internal. As in, it might be an external coach, it might be internal planning, it might be internal personal planning. But you got to not just spend years and years and years of your life working, leading a business that you don't care for, that's got nothing that stirs the emotions in you, nothing that gives you great joy and value. You have one single life that you need to make the most of. You are the architect of your business and you can do something that gives you great joy. You just got to figure out what it is. So I think that really it's the first thing is ask yourself, am I in love with my business? If not, why not? How do I act on or work on that? So I guess as we start to wrap up, what's one takeaway from each of you for leaders on this topic?
Perhaps one thing could be perhaps using this time of reflection to put some deep thinking, even write it down. What would be different in a year time for you, owner, leader, and how would you like to feel in a year time? What would have to be different? What would have to be the same? Because starting is the key point. It doesn't matter if you write it down by hand or if you actually discuss it with your team, but just starting to reflect, starting to shift that feeling is probably step number one.
Yeah, I build on that. I mean, I think it's easy to have the flight response and maybe it's time for a little bit of fight. The very fight that caused you to do this courageous thing in the first place. Go back and revisit that for a moment. And what was that? Because once you feel that, right, that emotion, that sense in yourself, I think you get to what was that thing that caused the excitement. And once you know that, then you, as you said, Andres, I think it's about then imagining the one simple step you could take, because this is not going to get solved in, a click of the fingers. It's going to get solved through doing some hard work. I often hear this so much, and when I look at the business overall, I go, this is an amazing business you would want to own every day, any day, for as long as you possibly could. And it's really just about finding that personal connection back to the business again. And I think that is often at the heart of the biggest challenges that folks face listening to this call.
Great way to wrap it up. As we approach, depending on when you're listening to this, or have recently passed the new calendar year, January 1st. In a year's time, do you want to be in love with the business or do you want to feel the same way is really what we're saying. And it's the action that you take. I'm not a huge fan of New Year's resolutions, but I am a huge fan of thinking, what do I want to be different in a year? And then taking action around that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the Evolution Partners Podcast Summer Series. Fall in love with your business again. What an interesting and perhaps different topic. We have a few books that I'm going to quickly mention. Made to Thrive, we mentioned it in the podcast, The 5 Roles of a CEO. Number 2, Onboarded, how to bring your new hires to the point where they're effective faster. The next one is Onboarded for Managers, a narrative book that you can give to managers to get them to understand onboarding. And then, of course, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better, avoiding the pressure for endless growth to build a better business and life. And you can find us at evolutionpartners.com.au. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. I hope you have a great week through this fabulous summer. Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.